At 61, Silas Grant owned more Wyoming land than most men could dream of, yet ate canned beans alone every night in his empty mansion overlooking the Powder River. When he posted for a housekeeper, he expected some meek woman who'd cook and clean without fuss. Instead, Joe McClary rode up on a paint mare with a cracked saddle and broken dreams. This former rodeo champion had lost everything except her horse and her stubborn pride. She asked only for barn space and wages, but what she brought to his lonely ranch was something money couldn't buy. What happens when two weathered souls discover that sometimes the best things in life come with 4 legs and a heart full of hope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then pauses. The morning sun crested the Bighorn Mountains, casting long shadows across the 20,000-acre Grant Ranch. Silas Grant stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the light dance across pastures that stretched to the horizon. At 61, his shoulders still carried the breadth of a man who'd spent decades working cattle, though these days he paid others to do the heavy lifting. His thick silver hair, combed back with the same precision he applied to everything else, caught the early light. The weathered lines around his grey eyes spoke of years squinting into prairie wind and measuring the worth of land and livestock with a glance. The mansion behind him, 12 rooms of polished oak and imported stone, felt more like a museum than a home. His late wife Eleanor had designed every corner with meticulous care 25 years ago, back when they'd believed their children would fill these halls with laughter and muddy boots. Now the Persian rugs lay perfectly undisturbed, the dining room table set for one, and dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight through windows that hadn't heard a child's voice in over a decade. Silas finished his black coffee and set the mug in the sink, where it joined yesterday's dishes. He'd fired the last housekeeper 3 months ago, nervous woman from town, who treated him like an invalid and rearranged Eleanor's things. Since then, he'd managed on his own, eating straight from cans when hunger struck, and letting the laundry pile up until necessity forced him to the washing machine. The crumpled newspaper ad lay on the kitchen counter where he'd left it after 3 weeks of no responses. Housekeeper wanted. Rural ranch setting. Room and board plus wages. References required. He'd written it in his careful script, thinking someone would answer quickly. Most folks in Powderhorn County knew the Grant name, knew he paid fair wages. But the silence had stretched on, leaving him to wonder if his reputation for keeping to himself had spread further than he'd realized. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel made him look up from the newspaper. Through the window, he watched a rider approach on a paint horse that had seen better days. The mare's coat showed patches of brown and white beneath a layer of trail dust, and her gait spoke of long miles recently traveled. The rider sat straight, despite the obvious weariness, hat pulled low against the morning sun. As they drew closer to the house, Silas could make out more details. The rider was a woman, her face shadowed beneath a hat with a cracked brim. Her clothes-worn jeans, faded flannel shirt, and scuffed boots told the story of someone who'd been traveling rough. A bedroll and small pack were tied behind her saddle, along with what looked like a grain sack for the horse. She dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on foot, her movements careful but confident. The paint mare stood patiently, head drooping with fatigue, while the woman straightened her shoulders and walked toward the front door. Silas opened it before she could knock, studying her with the same attention he'd give a new bull or a piece of land he was considering buying. She was probably in her mid-50s, with sun-weathered skin and auburn hair streaked with grey, pulled back in a practical braid. Her brown eyes met his without flinching, direct and honest. There was something in her Beringa, quiet dignity that spoke of pride worn thin but not broken. "Mr. Grant?" Her voice carried a slight rasp, as if she hadn't used it much lately. "I'm Joe McClary. I saw your ad in the Sheridan paper." "That ad's 3 weeks old," Silas said, not unkindly. He stepped back to let her in, noting how she wiped her boots carefully on the mat, despite their obvious need. "I've been traveling," she said simply. "Took me a while to work up the courage to come calling." In the front hallway, surrounded by Eleanor's careful decorating, Joe McClary looked even more weathered. But she held herself straight, taking in the polished wood and expensive fixtures without obvious awe or resentment. Her gaze lingered on the family photos, clustered on a side table Silas and Eleanor at their wedding, their children as babies, Christmas mornings from years past. "Coffee?" Silas offered, leading her toward the kitchen. "That'd be kind, thank you." As he poured 2 mugs, he studied her reflection in the kitchen window. She stood with the easy patience of someone accustomed to waiting, hands clasped loosely behind her back. No fidgeting, no nervous chatter. When he handed her the coffee, she wrapped both hands around the mug as if savoring its warmth. "You have references?" he asked. Joe reached into her shirt pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, worn soft at the edges. 3 letters, ranch work, mostly. One from the Hartwell place up in Montana, couple others from spreads in Colorado and Utah. Silas scanned the letters quickly. The handwriting was honest, the praise genuine, if brief. "Good ranching folks," he said, recognizing a name. "Says here you worked for the Hartwells 2 seasons." "Yes, sir. Until Mrs. Hartwell's arthritis got too bad for her to manage the household, and they downsized to that little place in town." Joe sipped her coffee, watching his face. "I can cook plain food well, keep house without fussing over things that don't need fussing. I'm particular about cleanliness, but not about having everything look like a magazine." "Room and board," Silas said, testing. "You understand that means the bunkhouse?" Joe was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "I was hoping for barn space, if that's all right. For me and my horse. Daisy's been with me 15 years, and she doesn't do well apart from me anymore." Silas looked out at the paint mare, who stood exactly where Joe had left her, reins trailing. The horse's patient stillness spoke of good training and a deep bond with her rider. "That horse looks like she's been traveling hard." "We both have." Joe's voice carried a note of weariness that went deeper than physical fatigue. "I can work for room and board if cash wages are a problem. Daisy doesn't eat much, and neither do I." There was no self-pity in her words, just practical honesty. Silas found himself respecting that more than any amount of pleading might have accomplished. He'd been hiring ranch hands and housekeepers for 20 years, and most folks either tried to sell themselves too hard or acted like they were doing him a favor by taking his money. "Standard wages," he said finally. "200 a week, plus room and board. Barn's got a clean stall and good hay. There's a tack room with a cot if you don't mind the smell of leather and horses." Relief flickered across Joe's features so quickly he almost missed it. "That would suit me fine, Mr. Grant. When would you like me to start?" "How about right now?" Silas nodded toward the living room, where dust-covered surfaces Eleanor used to keep gleaming. "This place hasn't had proper attention in months. You can get your horse settled first, though. She looks like she needs water and feed more than I need floors swept." Joe finished her coffee in one long swallow and set the mug in the sink. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I'll take good care of your home." As she turned to go, something in her movements caught his attention, a slight hitch in her step, carefully hidden, but there nonetheless. Old injury, probably. Ranch work was hard on bodies, and hers had clearly seen its share of hard times. "Mrs. McClary," he called after her. She turned back, and he saw that she was wearing a small silver buckle on her belt, the kind given out at rodeos. It was tarnished and worn, but the engraving was still visible. "Champion Barrel Racing, 1987. "It's just Joe," she said, "and thank you again for the chance." Silas watched from the kitchen window as she led Daisy toward the barn, speaking softly to the mare. The horse followed without a lead rope, ears pricked forward with interest at her new surroundings. There was something in the way woman and horse moved together that spoke of a partnership deeper than mere ownership. He poured himself another cup of coffee and looked around his pristine, empty kitchen. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Maybe it was just the prospect of decent meals and a house that didn't echo with every footstep. Or maybe it was something else, something in Joe McClary's steady brown eyes that suggested she understood what it meant to lose the things that mattered most. Outside, he could hear her talking to Daisy, voice low and comforting. The sound drifted through the open window like music he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Silas Grant had built his fortune on reading people and situations correctly, on knowing when to take risks and when to hold back. Standing in his lonely kitchen, listening to a weathered woman gentle her tired horse, he felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. He'd hired a housekeeper. What he might have found was something considerably more valuable, though it would take time for either of them to realize it. Joe settled into the tack room that first night, with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in everything else. The narrow cot was more comfortable than many places she'd slept in recent months, and Daisy's presence in the neighboring stall provided a comfort that went deeper than warmth. The paint mare had recovered quickly once her belly was full of good hay, and her thirst satisfied by clean water. The next morning, Joe approached the mansion as the sun painted the sky pale gold. She'd risen early, as was her habit, and checked on Daisy before walking across the yard. The silence of the big house felt different from the barn's peaceful, quiet, heavier somehow, weighted with memories and unspoken loneliness. Silas was already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a can opener in one hand and a tin of beans in the other. He looked up when she entered, and she caught something almost sheepish in his expression. "Morning," he said, setting down the can. "I was going to make some breakfast." Joe looked at the row of canned goods lined up on the counter: beans, soup, peaches, more beans. "When's the last time you had a proper meal, Mr. Grant?" He considered this seriously. Define proper. Something that didn't come out of a can. "Been a while," he admitted. Joe moved to the refrigerator and opened it, finding it nearly empty except for coffee, milk that was approaching its expiration date, and a few condiments. The pantry yielded flour, sugar, and other basics, but it was clear Silas had been subsisting on convenience foods for months. "I'll make a grocery list," she said. "For now, let me see what I can do with what's here." While she worked mixing pancake batter from scratch, finding eggs that were still good, brewing fresh coffee, Joe studied the kitchen more carefully. It was a beautiful space, clearly designed by someone who loved to cook. The stove was professional grade, the counters generous, the cabinets custom built. But dust had settled in corners, and the whole room felt unused, like a stage set waiting for actors who never arrived. "Your wife was a good cook?" she asked, flipping pancakes with the skill of someone who'd fed ranch hands and rodeo crews. "The best." Silas sat at the kitchen table, watching her work. "She could make anything. Used to say I married her for her biscuits." "Did you?" "No. I married her because she was the only woman I ever met who could out-stubborn me." His voice carried fondness mixed with old pain. "But the biscuits didn't hurt." Joe set a plate in front of him, golden pancakes, scrambled eggs, and bacon she'd found in the freezer. Real food, prepared with care. Silas took a bite and closed his eyes for a moment. "Been too long," he murmured. After breakfast, Joe began her real work. She started with the living room, moving through it with the systematic approach of someone who understood both respect and efficiency. Every surface was dusted, every cushion fluffed, every window cleaned until the morning light streamed through without obstruction. It was while cleaning the mantelpiece that she found it a family photograph that had been turned face down behind a ceramic vase. The image showed a younger Silas, with his arm around a beautiful woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair. Two children stood in front of them, a boy who looked to be in his early teens and a girl perhaps 10 years old. All four were smiling, caught in a moment of genuine happiness. Joe held the photograph carefully, studying the faces. The woman, Eleanor, she assumed had laugh lines around her eyes and the sort of natural grace that made expensive clothes unnecessary. The children bore their parents' features in different combinations, the boy favoring his father's strong jaw, the girl inheriting her mother's gentle smile. "You can put that back where you found it." Joe turned to find Silas standing in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. She hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was just dusting. And face down, that's where it belongs." There was pain in his voice, raw and unhealed, despite what must have been years of practice at hiding it. Joe looked at the photograph again, then at the man who'd turned away from his own family's memory. "They're beautiful," she said quietly. Silas's jaw tightened. "Eleanor died 6 years ago. Cancer. The kids." He stopped, shook his head. "They have their own lives now. Don't need reminders of their old man." Joe set the photograph back on the mantel, but she didn't turn it face down. Instead, she angled it slightly so it caught the light from the window, making the captured moment seem more alive. "Mr. Grant," she said, "losing people doesn't mean we have to lose their memory too." Easy words. His voice was bitter now. "You ever been married?" "Once. Long time ago." "Kids?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. "We tried. It didn't work out." Something in her tone made Silas look at her more carefully. He saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands stilled on the dustcloth. Old grief, he recognized. The kind that never quite healed but learned to live quietly in the corners of the heart. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Life doesn't always give us what we plan for." Joe resumed her dusting, but her movements were gentler now. "Doesn't mean we stop living, though." They worked in careful silence after that, Silas retreating to his office while Joe continued transforming the neglected mansion. She moved through each room like a gentle storm, bringing order without disturbing the essential character of the space. Eleanor's touches remained the arrangement of books, the way curtains were hung, the small decorative items that spoke of a woman's care. But the dust and neglect disappeared, replaced by the clean brightness of a home that was once again being tended. By midday, the difference was remarkable. Light seemed to fill spaces that had been dim, and the air itself felt fresher. Joe had opened windows that had been sealed shut, letting the Wyoming wind carry away months of stagnation. She found Silas in his office, bent over account books with the intense focus of a man trying to lose himself in numbers. The room smelled of leather and old paper, and every surface was covered with the organized chaos of a working ranch cattle records, feed bills, weather reports, market analyses. "Lunch?" she offered. He looked up, blinking as if surprised to find the day half gone. "You don't have to. Part of the job, isn't it?" They ate on the back porch sandwiches made from real bread and actual meat, not processed lunch meat, from a package. The view from here stretched across rolling pasture to distant mountains, and the silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. "How long have you been alone in this house?" Joe asked. Silas considered the question while watching his cattle graze in the near pasture. "Eleanor's been gone 6 years. Kids stopped coming home regular about 4 years ago." "Why?" He was quiet for so long that Joe thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "After Eleanor died, I wasn't fit company for much of anybody. Threw myself into work, buying more land, building the herd. Figured if I could just make enough money, prove I was successful enough, they'd want to be part of it." He took a bite of his sandwich, chewed thoughtfully. "Turns out, money's a poor substitute for a father who's actually present." "They know you miss them?" "Don't know if that matters anymore. Thomas is in Denver, has his own business. Sarah's in California, married to a lawyer. They send Christmas cards." Joe heard the weight of regret in his words, the kind of sorrow that came from realizing mistakes, too late to fix them easily. She thought of her own losses, her own choices that had led to empty rooms and quiet nights. "People can surprise you," she said. "Sometimes when you think it's too late, it isn't. You sound like you speak from experience." "Some." Joe stood, gathering the lunch dishes. "But mostly I speak from hope." That afternoon, as Joe worked her way through the upstairs rooms, she discovered more evidence of the family that had once filled this house. Children's artwork still hung in frames in what had obviously been their bedrooms. School photos traced the progression from gap-toothed grins to teenage dignity. Sarah's room held horse posters and ribbons from what looked like 4-H competitions. Thomas's was decorated with model airplanes and baseball trophies. Eleanor's presence was strongest in the master bedroom, where her jewelry box still sat on the dresser and her books remained stacked on the nightstand. But it was clear that Silas had been sleeping in the guest room down the hall. The master bedroom felt like a shrine preserved, but not lived in. When she came back downstairs, she found Silas standing in the living room, looking at the family photograph she'd repositioned earlier. He didn't turn when she entered, but she saw his shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. "I used to be a better man," he said quietly. "What makes you think you aren't now? Better men don't drive their children away." Joe moved to stand beside him, both of them looking at the captured moment of family happiness. Better men don't give up on themselves either. Silas turned to look at her then. Really look at her. He saw a woman who'd known her own share of loss and disappointment, but hadn't let it harden her completely. There was kindness in her weathered face, wisdom earned through hard experience. "Why are you really here, Joe McClary?" he asked. "A woman with your skills could find work anywhere. Why answer an ad from a bitter old rancher in the middle of nowhere?" Joe was quiet for a moment, considering how much truth to share. Maybe because bitter old ranchers in the middle of nowhere need somebody to answer their ads. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. They stood there together in the afternoon light, two people who'd been worn down by life, but hadn't been broken by it. The family photograph smiled down at them, a reminder of what had been lost and what might still be possible. That night, as Joe settled into her cot in the tack room, she could hear Silas moving around in the mansion. Not the restless pacing she'd expected, but the sounds of someone actually living in his space water running in the kitchen, the television turned on to something other than the Weather Channel, footsteps that didn't echo quite so hollowly in the polished halls. Change, she knew, often began with the smallest shifts. A photograph turned toward the light. A real meal shared in comfortable silence. The recognition that loneliness, while painful, didn't have to be permanent. Outside her window, Daisy shifted in her stall, content and secure. Joe closed her eyes and let the familiar sounds of the barn lull her towards sleep, thinking that for the first time in months she felt like she might be exactly where she belonged. 3 days into Joe's tenure at the Grant Ranch, she discovered the wooden spoon while organizing the kitchen drawers. It was tucked away in the back of the utensil drawer, wrapped in a faded dish towel, as if someone had hidden it deliberately. The spoon was beautiful in its simplicity, carved from what looked like cherry wood, worn smooth by years of use, with delicate leaves etched along the handle. Joe held it up to the light, admiring the craftsmanship. The wood had aged to a rich golden brown, and she could see the care that had gone into its making. This wasn't a store-bought utensil, but something created with love and attention. "Where did you find that?" Joe turned to see Silas standing in the kitchen doorway, his face gone pale. His eyes were fixed on the wooden spoon with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "Back of the drawer," she said carefully. "It's beautiful work." Silas moved closer, reaching out as if to touch the spoon, then stopping just short. "Eleanor made that our first Christmas. We didn't have much money then. I was still working for old Jim Morrison. Hadn't bought this place yet. She carved it from a piece of cherry wood her father had saved from a tree that came down in a storm." His voice was soft, remembering. Joe could see the younger man he'd been, probably not much different from the hard-working rancher she'd come to know, but lighter somehow, less burdened by loss. "She must have been quite a woman," Joe said. She was. Silas took the spoon from her hands, running his thumb along the carved handle. "Used to make everything from scratch, bread, preserves, even butter when she had time. Said food made with your own hands tasted better because it carried a piece of your heart." Joe watched him cradle the spoon like something precious and fragile. What happened to it? Why was it hidden away? Silas was quiet for a long moment. "After she died, I couldn't stand to see it. Reminded me too much of Sunday mornings when she'd be stirring pancake batter, humming some song she'd heard on the radio. I wrapped it up, put it away." Figured I'd throw it out eventually, but he shrugged. Never could quite do it. May I? Joe gestured toward the spoon. Silas handed it back to her, watching as she tested its weight and balance. The wood felt warm in her hands, seasoned by years of use and care. It's meant to be used, she said. Hiding it away doesn't honor her memory, it just makes the memory hurt more. Easy to say. Not easy at all. Joe moved to the stove, where she had soup simmering for lunch. But sometimes the things that hurt us are the same things that can heal us, if we let them. She stirred the soup with Eleanor's wooden spoon, her movements gentle and respectful. The utensil felt right in her hands, as if it remembered its purpose and was grateful to be useful again. Silas watched from the doorway, his expression cycling through pain, memory, and something that might have been relief. When Joe ladled the soup into bowls, using the wooden spoon as naturally as breathing, he saw his wife's kitchen come alive in a way it hadn't in years. "She would have liked you," he said suddenly. Joe looked up from the stove. "What makes you say that?" Eleanor had no patience for people who were wasteful or disrespectful, but she'd have appreciated how you handle things careful but not afraid. Like you understand that beautiful things are meant to be used, not just admired. They ate lunch with Eleanor's wooden spoon resting beside the soup pot, no longer hidden but taking its rightful place in the rhythm of the kitchen. The change was subtle but significant, like a note of music that had been missing from a familiar song. That afternoon, Joe worked on the upstairs bedrooms while Silas rode out to check on the cattle in the north pasture. She moved through Sarah's room first, dusting the horse posters and straightening the ribbons that spoke of a girl who'd loved barrel racing and jumping. The room felt frozen in time, waiting for someone who might never return. Thomas's room told a different story. His model airplanes suggested dreams of flight and adventure, while the baseball trophies spoke of earthbound achievements and team spirit. Photos showed him growing from a gap-toothed boy into a serious young man with his father's strong jaw and his mother's kind eyes. Joe found herself lingering over these traces of the family that had once filled the house. She could imagine Eleanor calling the children for dinner, Silas teaching Thomas to throw a baseball, Sarah practicing her riding in the arena that still stood behind the barn. The happiness that had once lived here felt almost tangible, like morning mist that hadn't quite burned off in the sun. When she reached the master bedroom, Joe paused in the doorway. The room was beautiful, four-poster bed with a handmade quilt, windows that looked out over the rolling pasture, furniture that spoke of comfort rather than ostentation. But it felt like a museum, preserved exactly as Eleanor had left it. Joe moved carefully through the space, dusting surfaces that were already clean, straightening items that didn't need straightening. On the dresser, Eleanor's jewelry box held simple pieces, wedding ring set, pearl earrings, a silver locket that looked like it might hold photographs. The nightstand held books Eleanor had been reading, bookmarks still in place after 6 years. It was clear that Silas came here sometimes. The items were too well maintained, too carefully arranged, for this to be a room he never entered. But it was equally clear that he didn't live here anymore. This was a shrine to memory, not a space for living. Joe was arranging the books when she heard Silas return from his ride. His boots on the stairs were hesitant, and when he appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face held the expression of a man entering sacred ground. "I should have told you to skip this room," he said. "Why?" "Because," he stopped, looking around the carefully preserved space. "Because it's Eleanor's room, was Eleanor's room. It's your room too, isn't it?" Silas leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking older than his 61 years. "Haven't slept here since she died. Couldn't stand waking up in that bed alone." Joe nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. Grief makes its own rules. Nobody else can tell you how to carry it. "The guest room suits me fine." "I'm sure it does." Joe moved to the window, looking out at the view Eleanor would have seen every morning. "But someday you might want to come home to your own room again. When that day comes, it'll be here waiting for you." Silas joined her at the window, both of them looking out at the land he'd built his life around. The afternoon light was golden, casting everything in the warm glow that photographers spent years trying to capture. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. "Next in what way?" "After loss. After the worst thing you can imagine happens. What comes after that?" Jo considered the question, thinking of her own experiences with endings and new beginnings. "I think we get to choose. We can stay frozen in the worst moment, or we can let ourselves move forward into whatever comes next. And if what comes next isn't what we wanted, then we find something to want in what we get." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Silas's cattle graze in the distance. The house around them felt different than it had when Jo first arrived, not just cleaner, but somehow more alive. As if the careful attention she'd given to every room had reminded the building of its purpose. That evening, Jo cooked dinner using Eleanor's wooden spoon and her own inherited knowledge of how to make simple food taste like comfort. Silas ate with the appreciation of a man rediscovering pleasure in basic necessities. When she served coffee afterward, he didn't retreat immediately to his office, but lingered at the kitchen table. "Tell me about your riding," he said. Jo looked up from her coffee cup. "What do you want to know?" "The buckle you wear. Champion Barrel Racing, 1987. That was a long time ago." "Different lifetime," Jo said, but without bitterness. "I was good for a while. Had the reflexes, had the horses, had more confidence than sense." "What happened?" Jo was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. "Horse fell coming around a barrel. Broke my collarbone, 3 ribs, and my wrist. Spent 2 months healing up, then went right back to it." "And?" "Fell again, different horse, same result, more or less. After the 3rd time, my husband said I had to choose between him and the rodeo." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Took me longer than it should have to realize there wasn't really a choice to make." "You chose the horses." "I chose what I was good at, over what I thought I was supposed to want. Turned out I was wrong about both." Silas heard the regret in her voice, the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. "You ever regret it?" "Every day for about 10 years. Then I realized regret was just another way of staying stuck in the past." Jo finished her coffee and stood to clear the table. "Now I just try to be grateful for what I learned and what I've still got." "Daisy?" "Daisy, and enough sense to recognize a good situation when I find one." That night, as Jo settled into a cot in the tack room, she could hear Silas moving around in the kitchen. The sounds were different, nowless, aimless, more purposeful. She smiled to herself, thinking of Eleanor's wooden spoon taking its place back in the rhythm of daily life. Change, she'd learned, rarely announced itself with fanfare. More often, it crept in quietly, in small moments of recognition and acceptance, a hidden spoon brought back to light. A meal prepared with care instead of convenience. The gradual softening of grief's sharp edges. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and Jo fell asleep to the sound of Daisy's contented breathing, thinking that sometimes the best things in life were the ones you discovered slowly, like treasures hidden in the back of dusty drawers. Jo's second week at the Grant Ranch began with an unexpected discovery. While organizing Silas's office to dust the shelves, she found a stack of veterinary bills rubber-banded together and tucked behind a ledger book. The top invoice was dated just 3 days before her arrival, and all of them bore the same patient name, Daisy McClary. The bills told a story Jo had hoped to keep private: emergency colic treatment in Utah, hoof care and shoeing in Colorado, X-rays for suspected lameness in Montana. The dates traced her journey across the mountain states, each stop marked by another expense she couldn't afford, and another debt that followed her like a shadow. Finding everything you need? Jo spun around, the bills clutched in her hands. Silas stood in the office doorway, his expression unreadable. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, the flush of someone caught in a situation that looked worse than it was. "I was just dusting," she said, then realized how defensive she sounded. "I found these behind your ledger." Silas stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. The gesture felt ominous, like a conversation Joe wasn't ready to have. "Dr. Patterson called me the day after you arrived," he said quietly. "Wanted to make sure I knew about Daisy's condition before I agreed to let you keep her here." Joe's stomach dropped. She'd hoped the kindly veterinarian in Sheridan would keep their conversation confidential, but she should have known better. Professional courtesy extended to other professionals, and Silas Grant was a major client. Her condition? Joe tried to keep her voice steady. Early arthritis in her front legs, old injury to her left hock that never healed quite right. Some digestive issues that need monitoring. Silas's tone was matter of fact, but his eyes were gentle. "Patterson said you'd been managing it well, but that the constant traveling wasn't doing her any favors." Joe sank into the chair behind Silas's desk, the bills still clutched in her hands. The numbers blurred as tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. "I know she'd be better off somewhere settled," she whispered. "I know I should probably." She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of parting with Daisy was like contemplating amputation. Silas moved around the desk and took the bills from her trembling hands. He scanned them quickly, his expression growing more serious with each invoice. "Joe, these bills total more than $3,000. I know. Most people would have put her down or sold her to someone who could afford proper care." Joe wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I thought about it, more than once. But she's been with me through everything. When my marriage fell apart, when I lost the house, when I couldn't find steady work, Daisy was the one constant in my life." Silas set the bills on the desk and leaned against it, studying Joe's face. "You've been paying these on installments?" It wasn't a question. Joe nodded, embarrassed by the truth of her financial situation. $10 here, $20 there. Whatever I could spare from each job." She looked up at him, needing him to understand. "I never missed a payment, Mr. Grant. I may not have much, but I pay my debts." "I can see that." Silas picked up one of the bills, the emergency colic treatment that had cost nearly $600. This was in Utah? 3 in the morning, middle of nowhere. Daisy started showing signs of distress, and I drove 40 miles to find a vet who'd come out. Joe's voice steadied as she remembered that terrifying night. "Dr. Rodriguez saved her life, but I didn't have insurance, didn't have savings. He let me pay $50 down and set up payments for the rest. And you've been carrying this debt across 3 states. I've been honoring my obligations." There was pride in Joe's voice now, the dignity of someone who understood the difference between being poor and being irresponsible. Silas was quiet for a long moment, looking at the woman who'd driven herself into near poverty rather than abandon a horse that most people would consider a burden. He thought of his own relationship with money, how easy it had become to write checks without thinking about the cost. When had he last made a sacrifice for something that couldn't repay him? "Dr. Patterson also mentioned that you've been managing Daisy's care yourself, giving injections, monitoring her diet, handling her exercise routine." Joe nodded. "I worked for a veterinarian in Colorado for 6 months, learned basic care. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing. Better than what most owners would do. She's not just a horse to me, Mr. Grant, she's my partner. We've been through things together that—" Joe stopped, realizing how sentimental she sounded. "I suppose that doesn't make much sense to someone who deals in livestock." Silas thought of his own attachment to this land, to the cattle that bore his brand, to the legacy he'd built over decades of careful work. "Makes perfect sense," he said quietly. He picked up his checkbook from the desk drawer and began writing. Joe watched in growing alarm as he filled in numbers that would cover every outstanding bill. "Mr. Grant, I can't let you." "You're not letting me do anything. I'm making a business decision." He tore out the check and handed it to her. "Consider it a signing bonus." Joe stared at the check, her hands shaking. The amount would clear all of Daisy's debts and leave her with a small cushion for future care. It represented freedom from a burden she'd carried for months, but accepting it felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "I don't take charity," she said finally. "Good thing this isn't charity. Silas's voice was firm but not unkind. "It's an investment in my employees' peace of mind. Hard to do good work when you're worried about money. I'll pay you back. I'm sure you will when you can. No interest, no timeline, just between us." Joe folded the check carefully and slipped it into her shirt pocket. The weight of it felt enormous, not just the money, but the trust it represented. Someone believing in her enough to take a risk. "Thank you," she said, the words barely audible. "Thank me by taking good care of that horse. And yourself." That evening, Joe called Dr. Patterson and arranged to settle her accounts. The relief in the veterinarian's voice was audible. He'd been worried about her, she realized, extending credit he probably couldn't afford because he recognized her dedication to Daisy's welfare. When she returned to the barn after dinner, she found Silas there, examining Daisy with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated horses his entire life. The paint mare stood patiently, accustomed to being handled by strangers. "She's got good bone structure," he said without looking up. "Solid back, good feet despite the arthritis. What's her breeding?" "Quarter horse, paint cross. Her sire was a barrel racing champion. Dam was bred for cattle work." Joe moved to Daisy's head, stroking the mare's neck. "She was fast in her day, faster than she had any right to be." "Like her rider?" Joe smiled. "We made a good team for a while." Silas finished his examination and stepped back. "Patterson's right about the arthritis, but it's manageable. Keep her on anti-inflammatories, moderate exercise, good footing. She's got years left in her." "You think so?" "I know so. And Joe," he looked at her directly, "you did right by her. Not many people would have made the sacrifices you made." That night, Joe sat on a hay bale in Daisy's stall, brushing the mare's coat until it gleamed in the barn light. The veterinary bills were paid, the weight of debt lifted from her shoulders, but the gesture meant more than just financial relief. Someone had seen her struggle and chosen to help, not out of pity, but out of respect for her dedication. "We're going to be okay, girl," she whispered to Daisy. "For the first time in a long time, we're going to be okay." The mare nudged her shoulder gently, as if she understood. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold, full of stars and possibility. Joe pulled her jacket tighter and allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stop running, to settle somewhere, and build a life instead of just surviving one day at a time. In the mansion across the yard, she could see lights in the kitchen where Silas was probably reading with his evening coffee. Earlier, she'd noticed him using Eleanor's wooden spoon to stir cream into his cooper, small gesture that spoke of healing beginning to happen in careful increments. Change, Joe reflected, often came disguised as kindness. A stack of paid bills, a horse given proper care, two wounded people learning to trust each other with their careful vulnerabilities. She thought of the check folded in her pocket, not as charity, but as faith someone, believing she was worth the investment. For the first time since arriving at the Grant Ranch, Joe allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might have found more than just a job. She might have found a home. The marriage certificate lay in the bottom drawer of Silas's desk, yellowed with age and creased from years of careful handling. Joe discovered it while organizing his filing system, a task that had taken on more complexity than either of them had anticipated. The document was folded between insurance papers and tax records, as if Silas had tried to file away the memory along with other important documents. Eleanor Catherine Walsh, married to Silas James Grant, June 15, 1985. The certificate was decorated with formal script and the seal of Powderhorn County. But what caught Joe's attention was the worn edges, evidence that someone had taken it out and handled it many times over the years. "That doesn't belong in there." Joe looked up to find Silas standing in the office doorway, his face pale. She'd been so absorbed in organizing the files that she hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry," she said, carefully refolding the certificate. "I was just trying to create a proper filing system, and—" "It's fine," but his voice suggested it wasn't fine at all. He moved into the office and held out his hand for the document. Joe hesitated. There was something in his expression, not anger, but a kind of desperate protectiveness that made her concerned about simply handing over what was clearly a source of pain. "Mr. Grant," she said gently, "maybe it's time this went somewhere more appropriate than buried in your business files. Where would you suggest?" His tone held an edge of challenge. "With your other personal documents, marriage certificates shouldn't be filed away like tax returns." Silas took the certificate from her hands, his fingers tracing the formal writing. "Eleanor always said I treated our marriage like a business arrangement. Maybe she was right." Joe heard the old guilt in his voice, the self-recrimination of someone who'd spent years wondering if he could have done things differently. She'd heard that tone in her own voice often enough to recognize it. "What makes you say that?" "Because I was always working, always focused on building something bigger, better, more successful. I thought that's what a good husband did, provided for his family, gave them security." Silas sat down heavily in his desk chair. "Turns out that's not the same thing as being present." Joe moved to the window, looking out at the land that represented decades of Silas's labor and ambition. "She knew you loved her, didn't she?" "I hope so. But love and attention aren't the same thing, are they?" Joe turned back to face him, seeing the weight of regret that he carried like a physical burden. "Tell me about your wedding day." Silas looked surprised by the question. "Why?" "Because right now you're remembering all the ways you think you failed her, but that certificate represents a day when you both chose each other. That must have been worth something." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb still tracing the edges of the marriage certificate. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "It was a small ceremony. Eleanor didn't want anything fancy, said the important part was the promise, not the party. We got married in the little church in town, had the reception in her parents' backyard." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "She wore her grandmother's dress, and I wore the only suit I owned. Father McKenna kept the ceremony short because he knew I was nervous." "What made you nervous?" "Marrying someone too good for me." The smile faded. "Eleanor could have had anyone. She was beautiful, smart, kind, came from a family that had money and education. I was just a ranch hand with big dreams and empty pockets. But she chose you." "She did. Said she'd rather build something with a man who worked hard than inherit something from a man who didn't." Silas looked at the certificate again. "For our first anniversary, she had this framed and hung it in our bedroom. Said it was the most important contract she'd ever signed." Joe felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of the kind of love that builds slowly, based on respect and shared effort, rather than just passion. "When did you take it down?" "After she died. Couldn't stand looking at it every morning, being reminded of promises I felt like I'd broken." "What promises?" "To love, honor, and cherish, to be there in sickness and in health." Silas's voice grew bitter. "I was there for the sickness part, sat by her hospital bed, held her hand through the chemo, slept in those awful chairs. But I wasn't there for most of the health part. Too busy building this empire that she never asked for." Joe moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. "Did she ever say you'd broken your promises?" "No. Even at the end, when she was so sick she could barely speak, she told me she was proud of what we'd built together." Silas's voice cracked slightly. "She said the ranch would be her legacy too, because it was the life we'd created together." "Then maybe the problem isn't that you broke your promises. Maybe the problem is that you're holding yourself to a standard of perfection that no human being could meet." Silas looked up at her, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering in his eyes. "You think so?" "I think Eleanor married a good man who worked hard to take care of his family. I think she understood that providing for the people you love is one way of showing love, even if it's not the only way." Joe paused, choosing her words carefully. "And I think if she could see you isolated, punishing yourself, pushing away the children you love, she'd want you to forgive yourself and start living again." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of years of unexpressed grief settling between them. Finally, Silas stood and moved to a small bookshelf that held his personal items, a few photographs, some awards from the Cattlemen's Association, a wooden box that looked handmade. She made this for me, he said, picking up the box. Our second Christmas. Said every man needed a place to keep his important things. He opened it to reveal a collection of small treasure she's wedding ring, which he'd stopped wearing after Eleanor died, a pressed flower from their first anniversary, a few photographs, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been read many times. What's that? Joe asked. Silas unfolded the paper carefully. A letter she wrote me during her last stay in the hospital. I found it on my pillow. After her funeral, she must have asked the nurse to put it there. Have you read it recently? Not in years. Too hard. Joe watched him struggle with the decision, understanding the kind of courage it took to face certain kinds of pain. Sometimes the things that hurt us the most are the things we most need to hear. Silas looked at her for a long moment, then began to read aloud, his voice steady, despite the emotion in his words. My dearest Silas, if you're reading this, then I'm not there to tell you these things myself, and I need you to hear them. You are not perfect, but you are good. You are not without flaws, but you are without malice. You built us a life that was rich in all the ways that matter, and I have never for one moment regretted choosing you. I know you will blame yourself for things you think you should have done differently. Please don't. The man I married was strong enough to work 18-hour days, so his family would never want for anything. The same man was gentle enough to sit up all night with a sick calf, tender enough to dry my tears when the doctor said we couldn't have children, and wise enough to love our adopted children as if they were born to us. Take care of Thomas and Sarah, but don't try to buy their love. They already have it. They just need to feel yours. Take care of the ranch, but don't let it become more important than the relationships that give your life meaning. And please, my love, take care of yourself. Find someone to share meals with, someone to laugh with, someone who reminds you that life is for living, not just working. I will love you forever, in this life and whatever comes after. Eleanor. When he finished reading, Silas carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the box. Joe saw tears on his cheeks, but also something that looked like relief. She knew you, Joe said quietly. Better than I knew myself, apparently. And she loved you anyway, despite my flaws. Because of your flaws, because you were real, not perfect. Joe moved to stand beside his chair. The man she describes in that letter, that's the man I've come to know these past few weeks. Hard-working, generous, kind, maybe a little lonely, but not broken. Silas looked up at her, really seeing her for perhaps the first time since she'd arrived. Not just as the housekeeper who'd answered his ad, but as a woman who'd shown up when he needed her most, who'd brought warmth back into his cold house, who'd listened to his pain without judgment. Joe, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes? I'm glad you're here. The simple words carried more weight than flowery declarations might have. Joe felt something warm, unfurl in her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten how to recognize. I'm glad I'm here too, she said. That evening, they shared dinner on the back porch, despite the October chill. Silas had lit the outdoor heater, and they wrapped themselves in blankets while watching the sun set over the mountains. The conversation was easier than it had been before, as if reading Eleanor's letter had given him permission to be himself rather than the grief-stricken widower he'd been playing for 6 years. Tell me about your marriage, he said as they lingered over coffee. Joe was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. It was complicated. We wanted different things, and neither of us was willing to compromise. What did you want? To keep riding, to compete, to travel, to live that life for as long as my body would let me. Joe smiled ruefully. I thought if I could just win enough, make enough money, prove I was good enough, then everything else would fall into place. And what did he want? A wife who stayed home, children, a normal life with predictable rhythms. Joe pulled her blanket tighter. He wasn't wrong to want those things. They just weren't things I could give him. Do you regret choosing the rodeo? I regret hurting him. I regret not being honest about what I needed sooner. But I don't regret trying to be the best at something I loved. She looked at Silas. Do you regret building all this? I regret not finding better balance. But no, I don't regret providing for my family or building something that will last." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd made difficult choices and lived with the consequences. The night was clear and cold, full of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air. "Eleanor was right, you know," Joe said finally. "About what?" "You do need someone to share meals with, someone to remind you that life is for living." Silas looked at her in the flickering light from the heater. "Is that an application for the position?" Joe felt her heart skip. "Maybe. If you're hiring—" "The benefits are good," he said, his voice light but his eyes serious. "Room, board, and all the home cooking you can stand. Sounds like a fair deal." Later that night, Joe lay in her cot, listening to the familiar sounds of the barn daisy's quiet breathing, the rustle of hay, the settling of old wood. But her mind was on the man in the mansion across the yard, and the way he'd looked at her when she'd suggested that maybe they could be more than employer and employee. Change, she thought, sometimes announced itself quietly, in the space between what was and what might be, in the courage to read old letters and the wisdom to recognize new possibilities, in the decision to stop punishing yourself for being human and start living like you deserved happiness. For the first time in years, Jo allowed herself to hope for something more than just survival, something that looked like home. The rodeo program was tucked between the pages of an old photo album Jo had been organizing in the living room. The paper was brittle with age, the colors faded, but the image on the cover was still clear. A younger Jo McClary astride a magnificent bay mare, both horse and rider caught in perfect form as they rounded a barrel at full speed. The headline read, "Western States Championship, 1987, and below it, Jo McClary claims third consecutive title. Jo held the program carefully, transported back to that moment when everything in her life had made sense. She remembered that day, the feel of the arena, dirt beneath her horse's hooves, the roar of the crowd, the perfect communication between horse and rider that made them move as one. She'd been 24 years old and invincible, certain that the future held nothing but more victories and greater triumphs. "That you?" She turned to find Silas standing behind her, looking over her shoulder at the program. His expression was one of genuine admiration mixed with surprise. "A long time ago," she said, starting to close the album. "Wait." Silas sat down beside her on the couch. "Let me see that." Reluctantly, Jo handed him the program. He studied the cover photograph with the careful attention of someone who understood horses and riding. "That's incredible form," he said. "The horse is completely collected, and you're—" He shook his head in amazement. "You're barely touching the reins. That's pure seat and balance." Cherry was special, 1 in a million. "What happened to her?" Joe's expression grew sad. "Colic, 2 years after this photo was taken, lost her on a hot summer day in Nevada. The vet said there was nothing anyone could have done, but you blamed yourself anyway." "I should have seen the signs sooner, should have called the vet earlier, should have been psychic?" Silas's voice was gentle but firm. "Joe, I've been around horses my whole life. Sometimes they get sick, and sometimes they die, and there's nothing human skill or love can do about it." Jo took the program back, her fingers tracing the image of Cherry in full flight. "She was my partner in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. We moved together like we shared the same mind. I can see that in the picture. The trust between you is obvious." Jo flipped through the program, showing him the results from that day. First place in barrel racing, second in pole bending, third in the rescue race. Her name appeared throughout the program in advertisements for feed companies, in articles about rising stars in women's rodeo, in the list of champions who dominated the circuit that year. "You were famous," Silas said, reading over her shoulder. "In a very small world, maybe. But yes, for a few years I was somebody in the rodeo community." Jo pointed to a small article near the back. "That's about my 3 consecutive championships. They called me Lightning Joe because of how fast my times were." Silas read the article, his expression growing more impressed with each line. It says here you set 2 arena records that season. Records that stood for 8 years. Why didn't you ever mention this? Joe closed the program and set it aside. Because it doesn't matter anymore. That person, Lightning Josh, doesn't exist. I'm just Joe McClary now, a woman who takes care of houses and horses. That's not true. It is true. The riding ended when Cherry died. My husband was right. I was living in the past, chasing something that was already over. Joe's voice carried old pain and regret. I should have accepted that sooner. Silas picked up the program again, studying the photograph with new understanding. This is why you couldn't give up competing. This is what you lost when you made that choice. I lost more than that. After Cherry died, I tried to keep going with other horses, but it was never the same. The timing was off, the trust wasn't there. I started having accidents. The falls you mentioned. 3 bad ones in 2 years. Each time, I told myself it was just bad luck, that I could work through it. But the truth was, I was riding scared, and scared riders make mistakes. Joe stood and moved to the window, looking out at the pasture where Daisy grazed peacefully. The last fall was in Denver. I was coming around the 3rd barrel when my horse stumbled. I went down hard, broke my shoulder in 2 places. Spent 6 months in physical therapy, learning to use my arm again. That's when you stopped competing. That's when the circuit stopped wanting me. Word gets around when a rider becomes a liability. Sponsors dropped me. Events stopped calling with invitations. By the time I was physically ready to ride again, I was professionally finished. Silas joined her at the window, both of them watching Daisy in the afternoon light. How old were you? 31. Old enough to know better, too young to accept that my career was over. What did you do? Fell apart for a while. Drank too much, felt sorry for myself, blamed everyone except the person responsible. Joe's voice was matter-of-fact, but Silas heard the shame underneath. My husband tried to be supportive, but watching someone you love destroy themselves gets old fast. Is that when the marriage ended? Not immediately. We limped along for another few years, both of us pretending things could go back to normal. But normal for me had been the road, the competition, the adrenaline. Normal for him had been a wife who was gone half the year chasing belt buckles and prize money. Silas absorbed this, understanding better now why Joe had seemed so careful about accepting his help, so determined to maintain her independence. She'd lost her identity once before and was determined not to let it happen again. The woman in that photograph, he said carefully, she's still part of who you are. No, she's not. That woman was fearless. This woman is afraid of her own shadow. This woman traveled across 3 states with an arthritic horse, managing her care with skills she taught herself. This woman answered an ad from a stranger and rode into a new life with nothing but courage and hope. Silas turned to face her. That sounds pretty fearless to me. Joe met his eyes, seeing something there that made her heart skip. That's different. How? Because the stakes are different. When I was riding, the worst thing that could happen was injury or failure. Now, she stopped, unable to finish the thought. Now what? Now the worst thing that could happen is losing the only home I've had in years. Losing. She gestured helplessly between them. Whatever this is that's happening between us. Silas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his eyes, the lines that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie sun. Joe, you're not going to lose this. Not if you don't want to. How can you be sure? Because I've watched you these past few weeks. I've seen how you handle everything with grace and competence. I've seen how you care for Daisy, how you've brought this house back to life, how you've helped me remember who I used to be before grief made me forget. His voice was low, intense. The woman who could do all that isn't someone who runs from challenges. She's someone who meets them head-on. Joe felt tears threatening, but they weren't tears of sadness. I don't know how to be that person anymore. You already are that person. You just haven't realized it yet. The space between them felt charged with possibility. Joe could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. When he reached up to touch her cheek, she didn't pull away. "Lightning Joe," he said softly. don't call me that. Why not? It's who you are. It's who I was. Same thing. Before she could argue, he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, a question more than a statement. When she kissed him back, it became something deeper, a recognition of shared loneliness and the possibility of shared healing. When they finally broke apart, Joe felt dizzy. It had been years since anyone had kissed her like that, with tenderness and desire and the promise of something more. "Silas," she whispered, "I know. This complicates things. Everything's already complicated." He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Then a little more complication won't hurt." That evening, they cooked dinner together for the first time. Joe found herself hyper-aware of every time he passed behind her, every accidental touch as they moved around the kitchen. The domestic intimacy felt both natural and terrifying. "Tell me about the best ride you ever had," Silas said as they sat down to eat. Joe considered the question. Not the most successful one, necessarily. The one that made you feel most alive. She smiled, remembering. There was a night event in Cheyenne, summer of 1986. The arena lights had gone out during the previous event, so they were running behind schedule. When my turn came, it was almost midnight, and they were using temporary lighting that left shadows everywhere. Sounds dangerous. It was. Most riders would have asked to wait until morning, but I was young and stupid and needed the prize money. Joe's eyes grew distant with memory. Cherry and I went into that arena, and it was like we could read each other's minds. Every turn was perfect, every stride exactly right. We ran that pattern in near darkness, trusting each other completely. What was your time? 16.89. Still the best barrel racing time I ever posted. Joe looked at Silas. But that wasn't what made it special. What made it special was the feeling that for those 17 seconds, Cherry and I were perfect together. We were exactly what we were meant to be. "That's how I feel about this land sometimes," Silas said. "Like it's part of me, like I was meant to be here. And now I'm starting to think maybe I was meant to share it with someone." The words hung between them, full of possibility and promise. Joe felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of protective walls she'd built over years of disappointment and loss. Later, as she settled into a cot in the tack room, Joe found herself thinking about the rodeo program and the woman she'd been in that faded photograph. Maybe Silas was right. Maybe Lightning Joe wasn't dead, just dormant. Maybe it was possible to reclaim parts of yourself that you thought were lost forever. Outside, the November wind carried the promise of winter, but inside the barn, surrounded by the sounds of Daisy's contentment and the knowledge that across the yard a good man was thinking about her, Joe felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she was home. The land deed was tucked inside a manila envelope at the bottom of a box Joe found while cleaning the basement storage room. She'd been looking for Christmas decorations at Silas's request. November had arrived with its first serious snowfall, and he'd mentioned wanting to put up lights for the first time since Eleanor died. The box was labeled Ease Papers in Silas's careful handwriting, clearly items he'd packed away but couldn't bring himself to discard. Joe almost put the envelope back without opening it, respecting the privacy of Eleanor's documents. But the letterhead caught her attention, Powderhorn County Recorder's Office, and below that, a date from 1979. Curious, she slid the deed from the envelope and unfolded it carefully. The legal language was dense and formal, but certain words leaped out at her with shocking clarity. McClary Ranch, Section 12, Township 45 North, 640 acres. Joseph Franklin McClary and Mary Catherine McClary, husband and wife. Joe's hands began to shake. She read the deed again, slower this time, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The property described in the document encompassed the eastern section of what was now the Grant ranchland that included the very pasture where Daisy grazed each day. Joseph Franklin McClary, her grandfather. Joe sank onto a storage trunk, the deed clutched in her trembling hands. Her grandfather's ranch, lost in the drought of 1000, 983 when she was 20 years old, and too focused on her rodeo career to pay attention to her family's financial struggles. She remembered her mother crying when they'd lost the place, remembered her father's grim silence as they'd packed up their lives and moved to town. But she'd never known who had bought the land. "Joe, you find those decorations?" Silas's voice carried down the basement stairs, and Joe quickly folded the deed and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Her mind was reeling, trying to process the implications of what she'd discovered. "Still looking," she called back, her voice somehow steady despite the turmoil in her chest. She found the Christmas decorations in the next box, but her hands moved automatically while her thoughts raced. The land her family had worked for 3 generations was now part of Silas's empire. The pasture where she'd learned to ride as a child was where Daisy now grazed in peaceful retirement. The home where her grandparents had built their dreams was now contributing to the wealth of the man she was falling in love with. That evening, Joe cooked dinner with mechanical precision, responding to Silas's conversation without really hearing him. The deed felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, the weight of its implications growing heavier with each passing hour. "You're quiet tonight," Silas observed as they cleared the table. "Just tired. Maybe you should take tomorrow off. You've been working too hard." Joe nodded absently, then excused herself to check on Daisy. In the barn, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and horses, she pulled out the deed and read it again by lamplight. The signatures at the bottom told the story, her grandparents' careful handwriting transferring ownership to S.J. Grant Enterprises. The date was October 15, 1983, just 3 weeks after her grandfather's funeral. The sale price was listed as $127,000, far below what the land was worth even then. Joe remembered that autumn now. Her grandmother, overwhelmed by debt and grief, had been desperate to settle the estate quickly. Someone had made her an offer that would pay off the mortgage and leave a small amount for her to live on in town. It had seemed like a blessing at the time, salvation from bankruptcy and foreclosure. That someone had been Silas. Joe leaned against Daisy's stall, feeling the mare's warm breath on her cheek. Her family's legacy had become part of the foundation of Silas's wealth. The irony was bitter. She'd been sleeping in the barn on land that should have been her inheritance, working as a housekeeper in a home built with money that included the sale of her family's dreams. "Hey there, girl," she whispered to Daisy. "Turns out we've been home all along, we just didn't know it." The next morning, Joe waited until Silas left to check the cattle in the south pasture before driving to town. The Powderhorn County Recorder's office was housed in an old brick building that smelled of dust and yellowing paper. The clerk, a motherly woman named Mrs. Henderson, remembered Joe's grandparents with fondness. "Oh my, Joe McClary, I haven't seen you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Heard you made quite a name for yourself in the rodeo." "A long time ago," Joe said. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you about some property records. The old McClary place, Section 12. "Mrs. Henderson's expression grew sympathetic. "Still hurts, doesn't it? I remember when your grandmother had to sell. Such a shame, losing a place that had been in the family so long. Can you tell me about the sale? The details, I mean." "Well, the records are public, so I don't see any harm." Mrs. Henderson pulled out a thick ledger and flipped through pages. "Here it is, October 1983. Your grandmother was in quite a bind, poor thing. The ranch had been mortgaged to pay for your grandfather's medical bills, and there were back taxes owed too." "How much was owed?" "Total debt was about 89,000. That was a lot of money in those days." Mrs. Henderson traced the entries with her finger. "Mr. Grant offered to pay 127,000, which covered everything and left your grandmother with enough to buy that little house on Elm Street. Was it a fair price?" Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment. "Honey, your grandmother was facing foreclosure. The bank was going to take the place anyway, and she wouldn't have gotten a penny. Mr. Grant's offer saved her from losing everything." Joe absorbed this information, feeling some of her anger dissipate. Silas hadn't cheated her family. He'd rescued her grandmother from financial ruin. But that didn't change the fact that he now owned what should have been her heritage. Mrs. Henderson, was there ever any mention of a right of first refusal? Anything that would give the family a chance to buy the land back? Let me check the deed restrictions. Mrs. Henderson pulled out another file. No, nothing like that. Once the sale was completed, ownership transferred free and clear. Jo left the recorder's office with photocopies of all the relevant documents, her mind churning with questions and emotions she couldn't untangle. On the drive back to the ranch, she made a detour past the old McClary homestead. The house was gone now, torn down years ago to make room for a modern equipment barn. But the giant cottonwood tree where she'd hung a tire swing as a child still stood, and the creek where she'd learned to fish still wandered through what was now Silas's pasture. Jo parked by the fence and climbed out, walking to the tree that held so many memories. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice, teaching her to read the weather, her grandmother calling her in for lunch, her own young laughter echoing across the prairie. This land was part of her in ways that went deeper than ownership. It was where she'd learned to ride, where she'd discovered her love for horses, where she dreamed of becoming a champion. And now it belonged to a man who didn't even know its significance to the woman who'd been sharing his meals and slowly claiming his heart. That evening, Jo made Silas's favorite dinner pot roast, with potatoes and carrots, biscuits from scratch, apple pie for dessert. He ate with obvious pleasure, complimenting her cooking and sharing stories about his day. Every word felt like a knife in her chest. "Silas," she said finally, when they'd finished eating. "Yes? I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. "What is it?" Jo pulled out the deed and placed it on the table between them. "I found this today." Silas picked up the document, his expression growing puzzled as he scanned the legal language. When he reached the signatures, his face went pale. "Jo, the McClary Ranch, Section 12 of your property, my grandfather's land." Silas set down the deed with careful control. "I can explain." Can you explain how you ended up owning my family's heritage? Can you explain why you never thought to mention that the woman you've been kissing used to play in the creek that runs through your south pasture?" "I didn't know." His voice was quiet but firm. "Jo, I swear to you, I had no idea you were related to the McClarys. But you knew about the land. You knew you bought it from a desperate widow who was about to lose everything." "Yes, I knew that, and I paid her a fair price, more than fair, considering the circumstances." "Fair?" Jo's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "My family worked that land for 3 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1892. My grandfather built the irrigation system that still waters your cattle, and you think 127-0 was fair." Silas leaned back in his chair, his expression growing defensive. "Jo, I didn't steal that land. Your grandmother came to me. She was facing foreclosure, and I offered her a way out that let her keep her dignity and her independence. You offered her a fraction of what the land was worth. I offered her what I could afford at the time, and it was enough to solve her problems. If I hadn't bought it, the bank would have taken it, and she'd have gotten nothing." Jo stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Do you have any idea what it's like to discover that the man you're falling in love with built his fortune on the ruins of your family's dreams?" The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and painful. Silas felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "Jo, please, sit down and let's talk about this." "Talk about what?" "About how I've been sleeping in a barn on land that should have been mine. About how I've been working as your housekeeper on property my grandfather cleared with his own hands. About how we move forward from here." Silas's voice was steady, but Jo could see the pain in his eyes. "About how we don't let something that happened 40 years ago destroy what we're building now." Jo turned from the window, her expression torn between love and betrayal. "How do I know you didn't plan this? How do I know you didn't recognize my name and hire me because you felt guilty? Because if I'd known, I would have told you. I would have offered to sell you back your family's section, or at least offered you a partnership in the ranch. Would you? Joe's voice was sharp with hurt. Or would you have been afraid I'd want my land back? Silas stood slowly, moving toward her with the careful movements of a man approaching a spooked horse. Joe, I can't change the past. I can't give your grandfather back his health, or your grandmother back her husband. But I can try to make this right. How? However you want. We can draw up papers giving you ownership of the original McClary section. We can create a partnership agreement. We can. Stop. Joe held up her hand. Just stop. Don't you see? Anything you offer now looks like charity or guilt money. How do I know it's real? How do I know you're not just trying to buy your way out of an uncomfortable situation? The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying the promise of a hard winter. Because I love you, Silas said quietly. Joe felt tears start to fall. I love you too. That's what makes this so hard. Then don't let it be hard. Don't let something my 28-year-old self did destroy what we have now. It's not just what you did. It's what it represents. The power imbalance between us. The fact that I've been dependent on your charity without even knowing it. Joe moved toward the door, then stopped. I need time to think. I need to figure out who I am in all this, and I can't do that while I'm living in your barn and eating at your table. Where will you go? I don't know, but I can't stay here. Not right now. Silas felt his world tilting, the happiness he'd just begun to believe in slipping away. Joe, please don't do this. Don't let pride make a decision you'll regret. This isn't about pride. This is about truth, and the truth is, I don't know what's real anymore. She walked out of the kitchen, leaving Silas alone with the deed that had changed everything. Outside, he could hear her moving around in the barn, the sounds of someone packing quickly and quietly. Silas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document that had torn apart the first happiness he'd known in years. The signatures at the bottom, his own confident scrawl next to Mary McClary's shaky handwriting, told the story of a transaction that had seemed straightforward at the time. A young rancher expanding his holdings, an elderly widow solving her financial problems. He'd never imagined that 40 years later, those signatures would feel like evidence of a betrayal he'd never intended to commit. An hour later, he heard truck doors slamming and the sound of a horse trailer being hitched. He wanted to go to her, to find the words that would make her stay, but he understood that some conversations couldn't be forced. Some wounds needed time before they could heal. When he finally went to the barn, it was empty except for the lingering sense of hay and horses. Joe's few possessions were gone. Daisy's stall was clean and vacant, and the tack room that had been her refuge looked as if no one had ever lived there. On the workbench, she'd left a note written in her careful handwriting. Thank you for everything. I'll be in touch about settling my employment. The spare key is under the feed bucket. Silas read the note 3 times, looking for some hint of softness, some suggestion that this wasn't final. But the words were polite and distant, the kind of message one professional might leave for another. He walked back to the house through the November darkness, the silence heavier than it had been before Joe's arrival. The kitchen still smelled like pot roast and apple pie, but the warmth was gone. Eleanor's wooden spoon sat in the dish drainer, clean and waiting for hands that might never use it again. That night, Silas lay awake in the guest room he'd occupied since Eleanor's death, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the cruel ironies of life. He'd spent 6 years in isolation, convinced he didn't deserve happiness after failing his first family. When Joe had arrived with her quiet dignity and her loyal horse, he'd begun to believe that maybe second chances were possible. Now he understood that his past had reached forward to destroy his future in ways he'd never anticipated. The next morning brought no relief, only the echoing emptiness of a house that had briefly come alive and was now hollow again. Silas went through the motions of his daily routine: coffee, ranch work, paperwork, but everything felt mechanical and meaningless. It was Dr. Patterson who told him where Joe had gone. The veterinarian called 3 days later to check on some cattle vaccinations and mentioned in passing that he'd seen Joe McClary at the boarding stable outside Sheridan. "Staying at the Rocking R for now," Patterson said. Daisy looked good, though Joe seemed pretty shaken up about something. "Everything all right out there?" "Fine," Silas lied. "Just some staffing changes." But after he hung up, Silas found himself driving toward Sheridan, not sure what he planned to say, but knowing he couldn't leave things as they were. The Rocking R was a modest operation that catered to horse owners who needed temporary boarding. He found Joe in the arena, working Daisy at a slow trot. Even from a distance, he could see the change in her. The confidence he'd begun to recognize was gone, replaced by the careful wariness of someone who'd been hurt. She rode like she was afraid of making a mistake, like she expected disappointment around every corner. When she saw him standing at the fence, Joe brought Daisy to a halt, but didn't dismount. The distance between them felt both physical and emotional. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Patterson mentioned he'd seen you. Joe, we need to talk." "I don't think we do. I've been researching the land sale, talking to people who remember what happened." Joe's expression remained guarded. "And? Your grandmother was 3 months behind on her mortgage payments when your grandfather died. The bank had already started foreclosure proceedings. She had medical bills from your grandfather's cancer treatment that totaled over $40,000. Silas gripped the fence rail. "When I offered to buy the ranch, I wasn't taking advantage of her desperation. I was offering her the only way out of a situation that would have left her homeless and penniless. You still bought my family's land for less than it was worth. I bought it for what I could afford to pay and what she needed to start over. Joe, I was 28 years old, working 2 jobs and borrowing money to expand my own operation. I didn't have unlimited resources." Joe dismounted and led Daisy to the fence, close enough that Silas could see the pain in her eyes. "It's not just about the money, Silas. It's about what this means for us." "What does it mean?" "It means I can never be sure if your feelings for me are real, or if they're colored by guilt about what happened to my family. And it means I can never be sure if your feelings for me aren't influenced by the fact that I own something you think should be yours." They stared at each other across the fence, both recognizing the impossible position they'd found themselves in. The land that had brought them together was now the thing threatening to tear them apart. "There has to be a way through this," Silas said quietly. "Maybe, but I need time to figure out what that looks like." Silas nodded, understanding even though it hurt. "How much time?" "I don't know. Joe, I meant what I said about making this right, whatever it takes." "I know you did. That's part of what makes this so hard." Silas drove home to an empty house that felt like a monument to all the ways life could disappoint you just when you thought you'd found happiness. But as he sat in his kitchen that night, eating canned soup and thinking about Joe's wounded expression, he realized that this wasn't over. Love that real didn't just disappear because circumstances were complicated. If Joe needed time to figure out who she was in relation to the land and to him, then he'd give her that time. But he wasn't giving up on what they'd found together. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight required patience instead of action. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows and scattered leaves across the yard where Joe's truck had been parked just days before. Winter was coming, but Silas found himself thinking about spring, about the possibility that what looked dead might just be dormant, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. The legal summons arrived on a grey December morning, delivered by a nervous young man who clearly wasn't used to serving papers to ranches the size of Silas's operation. The envelope was thick and official, bearing the seal of the Wyoming State District Court and the return address of Morrison, Blake, Associate Sohn, of Cheyenne's most prominent law firms. Silas read the documents twice before their meaning fully sank in. Joe McClary was filing suit to reclaim ownership of the 640 acres that had been her grandfather's ranch, claiming the 1,983 sale had been conducted under duress and at below market value. The legal language was dense and formal, but the essence was clear. She wanted her family's land back. What stunned him wasn't the lawsuit itself. He'd half expected something like this after their confrontation. What stunned him was the thoroughness of the case Joe's lawyers had built. They'd uncovered land valuations from 1,983 that suggested the McClary ranch had been worth nearly twice what he'd paid for it. They'd found testimony from neighbors who claimed Mary McClary had been pressured into selling quickly. Most damaging of all, they documented other land purchases Silas had made during the same period, showing a pattern of buying distressed properties at below-market prices. The papers painted him as a predatory businessman who'd built his empire by taking advantage of vulnerable families in crisis. The characterization was unfair. He'd always paid fair prices and dealt honorably with sellers, but he understood how it could look to a jury that didn't know him. Silas called his own attorney, Frank Hutchinson, who'd handled legal matters for the Grant Ranch for over 20 years. Frank's assessment was blunt and uncomfortable. "This is going to be expensive and messy," Frank said over the phone. "Even if we wind, I think we probably will. It's going to cost you a fortune in legal fees and drag your reputation through the mud." "What's the worst-case scenario?" "Worst case. You lose the 640 acres plus damages. The property's worth maybe $2 million now, but with punitive damages, you could be looking at $3 or $4 million in total exposure." Silas felt the number hit him like a physical blow. It wouldn't bankrupt him, but it would severely damage his operation and force him to sell other assets to cover the judgment. "And the best case? Best case, we win on summary judgment, and this goes away quietly. But Joe's lawyers are smart. They wouldn't have filed unless they thought they had a real chance." That afternoon, Silas drove into Sheridan to see Joe. He found her at the boarding stable, working with a young horse that belonged to one of the other boarders. She was teaching the gelding to load into a trailer, using the patient, methodical approach he'd watched her apply to everything else in her life. "We need to talk," he said when she noticed him standing by the fence. Joe finished with the horse before acknowledging him. "I figured you'd gotten the papers by now." "Why, Joe? Why this way?" She faced him across the arena, her expression carefully neutral. "Because it's the only way I can think of to level the playing field." "Level the playing field for what?" "For figuring out what's real between us." Joe moved closer to the fence. "As long as you own my family's land, as long as I'm dependent on your charity, we'll never know if what we feel for each other is genuine or just guilt and gratitude dressed up as love." Silas gripped the fence rail, trying to control his frustration. "So you're willing to destroy us both to find out?" "I'm willing to risk everything to find out what we're really worth to each other. And if the lawsuit destroys any chance we had, then at least we'll know the truth." Silas studied her face, looking for some sign of the woman who'd shared his kitchen table and brought warmth back into his life. What he saw instead was someone who'd been hurt so many times that she'd learned to strike first rather than risk being vulnerable. "Joe, there has to be another way. Tell me what it is. We sit down together, without lawyers, and work out an agreement that's fair to both of us. I deed you back the original McClary section. We create a partnership for the rest of the ranch. We pretend this is about business when it's really about love." Joe shook her head. "I can't do that, Silas. I won't be bought off, even by someone I care about." "That's not what I'm trying to do, isn't it? You're trying to make the problem go away so we can go back to the way things were, but we can't go back. Too much has happened." Silas felt the conversation slipping away from him, felt the woman he loved disappearing behind walls of hurt and mistrust. "What do you want from me, Joe? What would it take for you to call off this lawsuit?" "I want you to fight me." The word surprised him. "What?" "I want you to fight this case as hard as you can. I want to know that if we end up together, it's because we chose each other after everything was settled, not because one of us gave in to make peace. You want me to try to destroy you in court? I want you to respect me enough to treat me as an equal opponent, not a charity case you need to manage." Silas understood then what she was really asking for. She wanted to prove to herself and to him that she was strong enough to stand against him and survive. She wanted to know that any love between them was built on respect rather than pity. And if I win, then you'll know I didn't come back to you because I needed your help. You'll know it was because I wanted to. And if you win, then I'll know you can love me even when I'm not dependent on you. It was the most complicated, painful, and potentially destructive way of testing a relationship that Silas had ever heard. It was also, he realized, the most honest. Over the following weeks, as lawyers prepared their cases and depositions were scheduled, the small community of Powderhorn County buzzed with gossip about the lawsuit. Silas found himself the subject of speculation and judgment from people who'd known him for decades. Some supported him, arguing that he'd always been fair in his business dealings. Others whispered that there had always been something ruthless about how quickly he'd acquired so much land. The stress of the impending legal battle affected every aspect of his life. He lost weight, slept poorly, and found himself questioning decisions he'd made decades earlier. Had he taken advantage of desperate people? Had his success come at the expense of families like the McClarys? Jo, meanwhile, was dealing with her own pressures. The lawyers she'd hired were working on contingency, but they expected her to cover court costs and expenses that were mounting quickly. She'd sold her truck and was working extra jobs to pay for expert witnesses and land appraisals. Dr. Patterson, who'd become an unofficial mediator between them, tried repeatedly to broker a settlement. "This is insane," he told Silas during a ranch call. "You two are destroying yourselves over something that happened before either of you was married. There has to be a better way. Tell that to Jo." "I tried. She's as stubborn as you are." Christmas came and went with barely any acknowledgement from either of them. Silas spent the holiday alone in his empty mansion, while Jo worked at the boarding stable, grateful for the distraction of caring for other people's horses. In January, as the trial date approached, both sides engaged in the ritualistic dance of legal warfare. Documents were exchanged, witnesses were deposed, and experts prepared to testify about land values and market conditions in 1983. The case had attracted attention from agricultural publications and legal journals, turning their private pain into a public spectacle. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Frank Hutchinson delivered news that changed everything. "Jo's legal team has found something," he told Silas over lunch at the Cattlemen's Club. "They've been digging through county records, and they discovered that your purchase of the McClary ranch wasn't the only distressed property sale that year." "What do you mean?" "They found 5 other cases where you bought ranches from families facing foreclosure, all at below-market prices, all from elderly owners who needed quick sales." Silas felt his stomach drop. "Those were all legitimate transactions. The sellers needed help, and I provided fair solutions." "I believe you. But pattern evidence is powerful in court. It's going to look like you made a business model out of buying distressed properties from desperate families." "What's the bottom line?" "The bottom line is that our chances of winning just got a lot worse. Jo's lawyers are going to paint you as a predator who built his empire on the backs of vulnerable people. Whether that's fair or not, it's going to be compelling to a jury." That night, Silas sat in his kitchen with Eleanor's letter spread on the table before him. Her words about taking care of relationships and not letting the ranch become more important than the people who gave his life meaning seemed prophetic now. He'd spent 40 years building something impressive and substantial, but what good was any of it if it cost him the love he'd finally found? The realization came to him slowly, but with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about a lawsuit or land ownership or even justice. This was about whether he valued his empire more than his heart, whether he was willing to risk everything he'd built for the chance of something real with the woman who'd brought his empty house back to life. The next morning, Silas called Frank and gave him instructions that made his attorney question his sanity. Then he drove to Sheridan to find Jo. She was in the arena again, working with Daisy this time, the first he'd seen them together since she'd left the ranch. Horse and rider moved with the fluid grace that spoke of decades of partnership, and watching them, Silas felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Jo," he called softly, not wanting to startle either of them. She brought Daisy to a halt and dismounted, her expression wary. "If you're here to talk settlement, I'm here to tell you that you're right. The words stopped her cold. What? You're right. About the land, about what it means, about everything. Silas stepped closer to the fence. I've been thinking about what you said, about fighting this case as hard as I can, and I realized something. What? I don't want to fight you, Joe. I want to fight for you. There's a difference. Joe stared at him, her hand resting on Daisy's neck. I don't understand. I'm dropping my defense. I'm going to stipulate to your claims and deed you back your family's land, all of it. Silas, no. That's not what I wanted. Yes, it is. You wanted to know what's real between us. You wanted to know if I could love you when you didn't need me. He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Well, now you'll know. When you own your family's land free and clear, when you have choices, when you can tell me to go to hell and mean it, that's when we'll find out what's real. Joe felt tears starting to fall. You could lose everything. I've already lost everything that matters. When you left, this place became just land and buildings again. It stopped being home. The lawsuit was never about the land. It was about you needing to feel strong enough to choose love instead of settling for security. Silas reached through the fence to touch her hand. So, I'm giving you that strength. I'm giving you your inheritance, your independence, your power to choose. And then what? And then I'm going to court you properly. I'm going to prove to you that you're worth more to me than all the land in Wyoming. I'm going to show you that some things, the best things, can't be bought or sold or owned. They can only be given freely by people who are free to choose. Joe looked at this man, who was willing to risk his life's work for the chance to love her without conditions, and felt something shift inside her chest. The fear that had driven her to file the lawsuit, the fear that she'd never be more than a charity case in his life, began to crumble in the face of such complete trust. Silas, she whispered. What, Lightning Joe? I think I've been an idiot. We both have, but maybe we can be idiots together. For the first time in months, Joe smiled, really smiled, with the brightness that had first caught his attention. Are you asking? I'm asking. But first, I'm giving you back what was always yours. Then we'll see what happens next. The wind across the arena carried the scent of snow and possibility, and for the first time since she'd found that old land deed, Joe began to believe that some stories really could have happy endings. The settlement agreement was drafted in Frank Hutchinson's office on a bitter February morning, with snow falling steadily outside the windows of the old brick building that housed Cheyenne's most established law firm. Joe sat across the conference table from Silas, her own attorney flanking her, while Frank shuffled through the papers that would legally restore her family's heritage. I want to make sure we're all clear on what's happening here, Frank said, his tone suggesting he still thought his client had lost his mind. Mr. Grant is deeding 640 acres of prime ranch land to Ms. McClary, along with water rights, mineral rights, and a cash settlement of $200,000 to cover her legal costs and provide working capital for ranch operations. Joe stared at the settlement agreement, the legal language making her head spin. This is too much, Silas. It's what's fair, he replied quietly. It's what that land would be worth today if your family had never lost it. Mr. Grant, Joe's attorney interjected, my client hasn't agreed to these terms. This settlement far exceeds what we asked for in our original complaint. Silas looked directly at Joe, ignoring the lawyers. What do you want, Joe? What would make this right for you? Joe studied the papers spread across the table maps, showing property boundaries, financial statements, transfer documents that would make her a landowner again. Everything she'd thought she wanted was right there, ready for her signature. So why did it feel wrong? I want to understand why you're doing this, she said finally. Because 40 years ago, I bought land from your grandmother when she was desperate and had no other choice. I convinced myself it was a fair transaction because I paid what I could afford and she got enough to start over. But the truth is, I benefited from her desperation. The sale was legal. Legal isn't always the same as right. Silas leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Your grandmother sold that land because she had to, not because she wanted to. The difference matters. Frank cleared his throat. Mr. Grant, I have to advise you that you're essentially admitting to the claims in Ms. McClary's lawsuit. This settlement could be seen as an admission of wrongdoing. Let it be seen that way, Silas said. Some wrongs need to be admitted. Joe felt tears, threatening. This wasn't how she'd imagined this moment would feel. She'd thought reclaiming her family's land would bring satisfaction, a sense of justice restored. Instead, she felt like she was watching a good man punish himself for something that wasn't entirely his fault. "Can we have a moment?" she asked the lawyers. "Alone?" Frank and Joe's attorney exchanged glances, then gathered their papers and left the conference room. Suddenly the space felt much smaller, intimate, despite the formal setting. "Silas, I can't take this." "Why not? It's your family's land." "Because you're giving it to me out of guilt, not because it's what you want to do." Silas was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the snow falling on the Wyoming landscape he'd spent his life working. "You're right. Partly right, anyway. I do feel guilty about how I acquired that land, but that's not why I'm giving it back." "Then why?" "Because I love you, and I can't build a life with someone who feels like she owes me everything." He turned back to face her. "This way, you'll own your own land, have your own money, make your own choices. If you decide you want to be with me, it'll be because you want to, not because you need to." Joe reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "I already know I want to be with you. You think you do, but you've been dependent on me since the day you arrived. You've never had the chance to choose freely. And if I take this settlement, if I become your neighbor instead of your employee, what then? Then I'll court you properly. I'll bring you flowers and take you to dinner and try to convince you that we could build something good together." Joe laughed despite the tears running down her cheeks. "You want to date me? At our age? I want to do whatever it takes to win your heart honestly." The settlement agreement lay between them, waiting for signatures that would change both their lives irrevocably. Joe stared at the documents, thinking about her grandmother's desperate choice 40 years ago and the ripple effects that had led to this moment. "What if I don't want to be your neighbor?" she asked quietly. Silas felt his heart stop. "Then you don't. You'll own your own land, and you can do whatever you want with it. I can sell it back to you. If that's what you want. I can lease it to you? Yes. I can propose a partnership where we combine our operations and work the land together." Silas looked at her more carefully, hearing something in her voice that gave him hope. "You could do that too." Joe picked up the settlement agreement and read through it slowly, her expression thoughtful. "This is generous, Silas. More than generous. It's what's right." "No. What's right is acknowledging that life is complicated, and people do the best they can with the information they have at the time." Joe set down the papers and looked at him directly. "Your 28-year-old self made a business decision that helped a desperate woman solve her problems. My 60-year-old self fell in love with a man who spent 40 years proving he's honorable and decent. Joe, I'll sign this agreement on one condition." "What condition?" "That you let me propose a counteroffer." Silas felt like he was on shifting ground, unable to predict what would come next. What kind of counteroffer? Joe stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered city. "I want the land. It is my family's heritage, and I do want it back. But I don't want your guilt money, and I don't want to bankrupt you out of some misplaced sense of justice." "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you deed me the 640 acres as agreed. In return, I'll pay you fair market value, what you paid my grandmother in 1983, but what it's actually worth today." Silas stared at her. "Joe, you don't have that kind of money." "No, I don't, but I can get a mortgage based on the land value. And I can earn the money to pay the mortgage by entering into a partnership with my neighbor, combining our operations and sharing the profits." "You want to buy your own land back and then go into business with me?" "I want to restore my family's ownership of their heritage without bankrupting the man I love. And then I want to build something new with him, as an equal partner, not as someone who owes him everything or someone he's trying to compensate. Silas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried since the day Joe had walked out of his kitchen. That's the most complicated business proposal I've ever heard. It's the most honest one you'll ever get. And the personal side of this arrangement. Joe turned from the window, her expression soft but determined. The personal side is separate from the business side. We'll figure that out like two people who choose each other every day, not like two people bound together by guilt or dependence or legal obligations. You're sure about this? I'm sure that I love you. I'm sure that I want my family's land back. And I'm sure that I want to build a life that's based on choice rather than necessity. Joe moved back to the table and picked up a pen. Are you willing to try it my way? Silas looked at this remarkable woman who'd turned down his generous offer in favor of a more complicated but more honest arrangement. She was willing to take on debt and responsibility rather than accept what could be seen as charity. She was insisting on equality, even when it was harder than dependence. I'm willing to try anything that keeps you in my life, he said. Then let's call the lawyers back in and rewrite this settlement. When Frank Hutchinson returned to find his clients drawing up a completely different agreement, he shook his head in resignation. You two are determined to do this the hard way, aren't you? We're determined to do it the right way, Joe said, her hand finding Silas's across the table. And what way is that? Silas squeezed Joe's fingers, feeling like he was about to step off a cliff into something unknown but wonderful. The way that lets us choose each other every day for the rest of our lives. The lawyers spent the next 4 hours drafting documents that would restore Joe's ownership of her family's land, while creating a business partnership between the McClary Ranch and the Grant Ranch. It was complicated and unconventional, but it was also honest reflection of two people who'd learned that the best things in life were worth working for, even when the work was difficult. As they signed the final papers, Joe felt a weight she'd carried for decades finally lift from her shoulders. The land her great-grandfather had homesteaded, that her grandfather had farmed, that her grandmother had lost in desperation, was coming home to the McClary family. But more than that, she was choosing to share her life with a man who'd proven he valued her independence as much as her love, who was willing to risk his own comfort to ensure she never felt beholden or dependent, who understood that the strongest partnerships were built on equality rather than need. 3 months later, on a warm May evening, when the Wyoming prairie was green with spring grass and alive with wildflowers, Silas found himself standing in the yard between his mansion and the barn where Joe had once lived. In his hands, he held a small velvet box that contained Eleanor's wedding ring, set the rings she'd worn for 26 years before cancer took her, the rings he'd kept in his desk drawer like a talisman of lost love. The past months had been a whirlwind of legal paperwork, bank meetings, and the practical business of combining 2 ranch operations. Joe had moved into the old foreman's house on what was now officially the McClary Ranch again, a modest but comfortable home that she'd transformed with the same quiet competence she'd once brought to his empty mansion. They'd work together daily, planning grazing rotations and irrigation schedules, negotiating with feed suppliers and cattle buyers. The partnership was proving successful. Joe's attention to detail and financial caution balanced Silas's expansive vision and willingness to take risks. But more than that, they discovered they enjoyed the rhythm of shared work, the satisfaction of building something together. The personal side of their relationship had developed more slowly, deliberately. Silas had indeed courted her properly, bringing her wildflowers from the meadow where her great-grandfather had first settled, taking her to dinner at the Cattlemen's Club where she'd insisted on paying her own way, spending long evenings on her front porch, talking about everything from cattle prices to childhood memories. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, Silas was about to take the biggest risk of his 61 years. Joe emerged from the barn where she'd been checking on a mare that was close to foaling. Daisy followed her out into the evening light, moving more slowly than she once had but still alert and interested in everything around her. The paint mare had thrived since returning to familiar pastures, her arthritis manageable in the place where she'd once been young. "How's Bella doing?" Silas asked, nodding toward the barn. "She'll probably foal tonight or tomorrow. First baby, so she's nervous." Joe wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at him more carefully. "You seem nervous too. Everything all right?" Silas took a deep breath, feeling like a teenager about to ask someone to prom. "Joe, there's something I need to talk to you about." "Sounds serious." "It is." He pulled the velvet box from his pocket and held it carefully between them. These were Eleanor's rings. Joe looked at the box without taking it, her expression unreadable. "Silas, let me finish, please." He opened the box to reveal the simple but elegant setter solitaire engagement ring and a plain gold band that had been worn smooth by years of love and work. "Eleanor wrote in her letter that she wanted me to find someone to share my life with, someone who would remind me that life is for living. I remember. I think she would have liked you. I think she would have respected the way you've insisted on equality in our relationship, the way you've made me work to earn your trust." Silas closed the box and looked directly into Joe's eyes. "I'm not asking you to replace her or to become someone you're not. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something new with me, something that honors what we've both lost while embracing what we've found." Joe felt her heart racing, but she also felt something else, a deep sense of rightness, as if this moment had been waiting for them through all the years of loneliness and searching. "Are you asking me to marry you, Silas Grant? I'm asking you to be my partner in everything, in the work we do, in the life we build, in whatever time we have left." He opened the box again. "These rings represent the promise that love is possible, even after loss, that second chances are real if we're brave enough to take them." Joe looked at the rings, thinking about the woman who'd worn them before her, Eleanor, who'd loved this difficult, generous man enough to want him to be happy even after she was gone. She thought about her own journey from the rodeo arena to this moment, all the choices and chances that had led her here. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "Eleanor had small hands like you. I had them cleaned and resized, just in case." Silas stopped, realizing he was rambling. "I'm hoping you'll say yes, but I'll understand if you need time to think about it." Joe reached out and took the box from his hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight of gold and diamonds, but the emotional weight of promises and possibilities. "Can I ask you something? Anything? If I say yes, are you going to try to take care of me? Are you going to want to solve all my problems and make all my decisions?" Silas smiled, recognizing the woman who'd taught him the difference between love and protection. "Joe, you've proven you can take care of yourself better than anyone I've ever known. You've rebuilt your life from nothing, reclaimed your family's land, and turned a failing lawsuit into a successful business partnership. If anything, I'm hoping you'll take care of me. And if I say no, then we'll keep being partners and neighbors and friends, and I'll spend the rest of my life grateful that you answered my ad for a housekeeper." Joe looked at him standing there in the evening light, this man who'd learned to love without trying to own, who'd risked everything to give her the freedom to choose. She thought about all the ways love could go wrong, the grasping, desperate kind that demanded everything and gave nothing back. Then she thought about the kind of love that trusted enough to let go, that was strong enough to insist on equality. "I have one condition," she said finally. Silas felt his heart skip. "What condition?" "I want to keep my name, Joe McClary. The McClary Ranch needs a McClary to run it." "Of course. And I want us to live in my house, not yours. Your mansion is beautiful, but it's Eleanor's house. I want us to build our life in a place that belongs to both of us. We can build a new house, wherever you want. And I want Daisy to live in the pasture behind our house so I can see her every morning when I drink my coffee." "Joe," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion, "are you saying yes?" Joe took the engagement ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "I'm saying yes to building a life together. Yes to being partners in everything. Yes to taking care of each other without trying to control each other." Silas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and reached for her, pulling her into his arms. When he kissed her, it tasted like promise and possibility, like coming home after a long journey. "Lightning Joe McClary," he murmured against her hair. "Soon to be Lightning Joe McClary Grant," she corrected, then pulled back to look at him. "Wait, that's not right either. What do you want to be called?" Joe grinned, the expression transforming her weathered face into something radiant. "I want to be called Happy." They stood together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the land that had brought them together and torn them apart and finally healed them both. Daisy wandered over to investigate, nuzzling Joe's shoulder with the gentle curiosity of a horse who'd seen many changes in her 15 years. "What do you think, girl?" Joe asked, stroking the mare's neck. "You approve of this arrangement?" Daisy snorted softly and moved away to graze, apparently satisfied that her human had finally come to her senses. "She's not easily impressed," Silas observed. "She's seen me make a lot of bad decisions over the years. She's probably relieved I finally made a good one." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they walked hand in hand toward Joe's house, their house now, the place where they'd build whatever came next. Behind them, Silas's mansion stood empty, but no longer lonely, a monument to one kind of love that had ended and made room for another kind to begin. The wedding ring set represented more than just a proposal. Accepted it represented the courage to risk love again after loss, the wisdom to choose partnership over possession, and the faith that some stories really could have second chapters that were even better than the first. In the distance, a coyote called across the prairie, its voice wild and free and full of the ancient music of the American West. Joe squeezed Silas's hand, thinking about all the generations who'd loved and lost and chosen to love again on this same land. Her great-grandfather, who'd homesteaded here with nothing but hope and determination. Her grandparents, who'd built a life together through drought and hardship. Her grandmother, who'd been strong enough to let go when holding on, would have destroyed everything. And now Joe and Silas, ready to write their own chapter in the long story of the McClary Ranch, proving that love could indeed outlive wealth, that some things were worth more than money, and that sometimes the best things in life came with 4 legs, a loyal heart, and the courage to say yes to happiness when it finally found you. 6 months after their wedding, on a crisp October morning when the cottonwood trees along the creek had turned gold and the air carried the scent of autumn, Joe stood beside the new ranch sign that had been installed at the entrance to their combined operations. The carved wooden sign read, "Grant McClary Ranch," in elegant script, with smaller text below. Established 1892, renewed 2025. The sign represented more than just a name change. It symbolized the successful merger of 2 lives, 2 histories, and 2 pieces of land that had been meant to work together all along. The hyphenated name honored both families, while creating something entirely new, just as their marriage had done. Joe smiled as she adjusted the small bouquet of wildflowers she'd placed at the base of the signpost. Today marked not just their 6-month anniversary, but also the completion of their new house, a beautiful log home situated on the ridge between what had been the Grant mansion and the old McClary homestead. From their front porch, they could see both pieces of their shared history while looking forward to the future they were building together. The sound of truck tires on gravel made her turn. A familiar pickup was coming up the drive, followed by a car she didn't recognize. As the vehicles parked near the house, Joe felt her heart lift with surprise and pleasure. Thomas Grant stepped out of the truck, looking remarkably like his father but with softer edges and a ready smile. Behind him came a woman Joe assumed was his wife, along with 2 teenagers who had the restless energy of kids who'd been traveling for hours. From the car emerged Sarah Grant Martinez, her dark hair streaked with silver and her face bearing the same intelligent expression Joe had seen in old family photos. With her came a man who was clearly her husband and 3 children ranging from elementary school age to college. Silas appeared on the porch of their new house, his face showing an emotion Joe had never seen before, pure, unguarded joy mixed with nervous uncertainty. He'd been hoping for this day since they'd sent wedding invitations to his children 6 months ago, but he hadn't been sure they would come. "Dad," Thomas called out, his voice carrying warmth that erased years of distance in a single word. "Son," Silas replied, stepping down from the porch with careful dignity, as if sudden movements might make this moment disappear. Joe watched as father and son embraced tentatively at first, then with the fierce intensity of people who'd missed each other more than they'd been willing to admit. Sarah joined them, and suddenly the three of them were holding each other and crying and laughing all at once. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry we stayed away so long. I'm sorry we let grief make us stupid." "No more apologies," Silas said firmly. "You're here now. That's what matters." Joe hung back, not wanting to intrude on the family reunion, but Sarah spotted her and broke away from the group hug. "You must be Joe," Sarah said, approaching with outstretched hands. "Thank you for the wedding photos. Mom would have loved seeing Dad that happy." "I hope so," Joe replied, accepting Sarah's embrace. "He talks about you and your brother all the time." "Good things, I hope." "Always good things. He's very proud of both of you." Over the next hour, Joe watched Silas transform as he reunited with his children and met his grandchildren for the first time in years. The formal, careful man she'd first encountered gave way to someone lighter and more playful, a grandfather who got down on his knees to examine a toy dinosaur, a father who listened intently to stories about jobs and schools and dreams. The children were initially shy around their newfound step-grandmother, but Daisy proved to be the perfect icebreaker. The old paint mare, now 20 and moving slowly but still gentle and patient, allowed herself to be petted and fed carrots while Joe told stories about rodeo life and adventures on the road. "Grandpa Joe was a champion?" asked Emma, Sarah's youngest, her eyes wide with admiration. "Still is," Silas said, wrapping his arm around Joe's waist. "She just competes in different events now." That evening, they gathered around the long dining table in the new house for a meal that felt like something out of Joe's childhood memories. Multiple generations, sharing food and stories, and the comfortable chaos of family. The house rang with laughter and conversation, alive in ways the old mansion had never been. After dinner, as the adults lingered over coffee and the children played board games in the living room, Thomas pulled Joe aside. "I want you to know something," he said quietly. "Sarah and we were angry for a long time after Mom died. Not just stayed angry. At Dad, at God, at the whole situation. Grief makes its own rules," Joe said, remembering her own words from months ago. "It does. And one of the rules we made was that Dad had to stay frozen in that grief forever. Like moving on would be a betrayal of Mom's memory." Thomas looked toward his father, who was helping his grandson with a puzzle. "But seeing him now, seeing how happy he is, I realize how wrong we were. He never stopped loving your mother. I can see that, but he also didn't stop living, and that's what Mom would have wanted." Thomas smiled. "Thank you for reminding him that he deserved to be happy." Later, as the family gathered on the front porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Joe felt a contentment she'd never experienced before. Silas sat beside her on the porch swing, his hand resting over hers, while 3 generations of his family filled the chairs and steps around them. "Tell us about the rodeo days, Grandpa Joe," said Michael, Thomas's teenage son. "Which stories do you want to hear?" Joe asked. "The ones where I was brilliant, or the ones where I was an idiot?" "The idiot ones," chorused the children, making the adults laugh. As Joe began telling a story about the time she'd gotten lost, driving to a competition, and ended up at a county fair instead, Silas felt something he'd thought was lost forever, the sense of family continuity, of love passing from one generation to the next. His children had come home, not to the house where they'd grown up, but to the life he was building with Joe. They'd accepted her not as a replacement for their mother, but as someone who made their father whole again. "Dad," Sarah said during a quiet moment, "we'd like to make this a regular thing. Family gatherings, I mean. The kids should know their grandfather and—" She paused, looking at Joe. They should know their grandmother too. I'd like that, Jo said, her voice soft with emotion. I'd like that very much. As the evening wound down and the family prepared to head to their hotel in town, the grandchildren extracted promises of horseback riding lessons and tours of the ranch operations. Thomas and Sarah made plans to return for Christmas, bringing their families for an extended holiday visit. It's different now, Sarah observed as she hugged her father goodbye. The ranch, it feels alive again. It is alive again, Silas replied. That's what love does. It brings things back to life. After the family left, Jo and Silas sat on their porch, swing in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. Daisy grazed peacefully in the pasture below them, her white patches visible in the moonlight. Think they'll really come back for Christmas? Silas asked. I think they will. I think they missed you more than they knew how to say. I miss them too, but I don't think I could have gotten them back if I hadn't found you first. Jo turned to look at him. This man who'd taught her that love could be patient and generous and strong enough to wait for the right moment. Why not? Because I had to learn how to be happy again before I could teach them that it was okay for them to be happy too. Silas pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair and the familiar smell of horses and sage that always clung to her clothes. Eleanor was right in her letter. I needed someone to remind me that life is for living. And now I remember every day. The Grant McClary ranch stretched around them in the darkness, thousands of acres of prairie and pasture that had seen generations of love and loss and renewal. Tomorrow there would be cattle to check and fences to mend and the 1,000 daily tasks that made up ranch life. But tonight there was just this, the satisfaction of work well done, family reunited, and love that had been strong enough to overcome pride and fear and the weight of the past. Jo thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the rodeo arenas where she'd been Lightning Joe to the desperate months when she'd had nothing but Daisy and hope. Every choice, every loss, every moment of doubt had led to this porch, this man, this life that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Silas, she said softly. Yes? I love you. I love you too, Lightning Joe McClary Grant. They sat together until the moon set behind the mountains, two people who'd learned that the best things in life were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth the courage it took to say yes when happiness finally knocked on your door. Around them, the ranch settled into the peaceful quiet of night, secure in the knowledge that it was no longer just land and buildings, but home to a family that understood the difference between existing and truly living. In the pasture below, Daisy lifted her head to look toward the house where her human had finally found her place in the world. The old mare nickered softly, a sound of contentment that carried across the prairie like a blessing, before returning to her grass and her dreams of galloping free under endless Wyoming skies.